So welcome everyone to the webinar today. My name is Megan Guidry and I am training lead here at NeSI. Our webinar topic today is 4 tips for getting started on NeSI, and we have NeSI's Research Communities Advisor Nooriyah Lohani here doing the main presenting today. This is the first webinar in our 3-part mini-series. So if you do enjoy the session, be sure to check out the NeSI website for more information about the other upcoming webinars. Now, before we get into today's topic, I do have a few housekeeping items to cover. We are planning for the session to take under 1 hour. It's most likely going to be 30 minutes or so, but it will just depend on the questions that we have in the discussion that we get into. I want to make it super clear that there are no silly questions, so please feel free to ask us anything. And there will be 2 ways for you to ask questions during the webinar. One way is to post your questions or comments in the shared document that I am posting into the chat right now. So if you can go click on that link that's in the chat, you'll see a shared Google Doc and some cues at the bottom of the page. If you have a question, comment, something you just want to share, pop it in there, and we have some NeSI guys looking at that document, and they'll be able to answer your question as they come up. Another way you can ask a question is to save it till the end of the session, and we'll have some opportunity for you to unmute yourself and verbally ask a question that comes up during the session. So feel free to wait until the Q&A at the end if you like. And let's see, what else? Of course, if you're not actively speaking, please keep your audio on mute so that we reduce background noise. And then lastly, the webinar recording and materials will be available on the NeSI website in the next few days. If you have registered for the webinar, you'll get an email when the content has been uploaded. So that is all from me. I will now pass things over to Nooriyah.
Cool, thank you, Megan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be here today. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Okay, I hope you are looking at my slides. Yep, cool. I can see Megan nodding. That's great. Today I'm just going to talk about a few tips and tricks and a few sort of keywords that were really useful for me to start using NeSI as a researcher. And I hope that you find this useful as well. And this is aimed at from absolute beginners to anyone who's quite familiar with the computer environment. So let's get started. Okay, so just to give you a little overview of what we'll be talking about today is I'll just give you a little bit of a workflow or sort of things that sort of you need to do or check before you get started on NeSI, some language that would actually really help you to communicate your requirements to us and would help us to help you better. I'll also talk about files and directories, how to sort of maneuver them and how they are organized on the NeSI cluster when you get a project. I will be talking about moving your data. So when you start a new project, you would like to move your data onto the NeSI computers to be able to start working on it. And I'll give you some tips that have been really useful for me when I first started using NeSI, and also some pointers on how and where to get help. So let's jump straight into it. Getting started on NeSI, it's a standard process, and it does require a few steps, but it's worth your while getting through them. So you would first start off with getting an account on NeSI. Once you have an account on NeSI, you can then request a project or allocation. You will then get a unique project code. And you can then set up a password and two-factor authentication, which helps you log into the system using a command line or using a graphical user interface like Jupyter. And the last step would probably be setting up terminal, but this would be optional. This just makes life a lot easier when you're trying to log into the system via your command line window. So this is just these links in the slides. I'm sure Megan will be sharing these slides with everyone here today, and also posting this video on the YouTube channel. So you could definitely get access to it after this. Right. So how do we actually communicate what we need on NeSI? These are some keywords that have been really useful for me, and I hope they're useful for you. You may have heard of these already, and you may already know what they are, but I'm just going to go through them really quickly. So a cluster is mainly a network of computers, and they're often called nodes. So I would call one of these CPU clusters, one of these purple and red boxes, a single node. And each node can have many CPU cores. And for reference, your laptop might have 2 cores or 4 cores, whereas the NeSI system, it has 1,000 cores. So that just gives you a reference for sort of the scale we are talking about when you think of NeSI. And then there's SSH, which is sort of a word that comes up very often, especially when you're getting started on NeSI. And this is basically, it stands for Secure Socket Shell. I won't go into any of the technicalities, but to simplify it, or perhaps oversimplify it, it's a secure way to actually connect into the NeSI computers via command line. So what I'm going to try to do here really quickly, before we continue. Oh, I didn't want to show you that, sorry. I'm just gonna go into my terminal. So when you open a command line window, that's kind of what it looks like. And so when I say SSH, what I essentially mean is it is basically a command. So I would SSH, and then I would enter the computer I want to use on NeSI, which is Mahuika at the moment. And I can then just enter my password and two-factor authentication to then log into NeSI, and this is what your first page would look like. So this was just to show you what I mean when I say SSH here. Okay, so the other words I wanted to talk about were disk space allocation. This basically just means the amount of storage space that you would like assigned for your project. And if you don't have an indication of how much sort of storage you'd require to successfully complete your project, that's fine. We have some default disk spaces that we allocate to projects where you're not sure on how much space you'd need. There's always an opportunity to request more disk space than what is assigned by default. It's a matter of emailing our support team at NeSI, and we could definitely work through that and give you more storage space if that's what your project needs. The other keyword I want to point out here is wall time, and this is actually the time that your computer program takes to run from start to finish. And this does not include writing the code. It does not include your computer program waiting in our high performance compute queue system. But it just, once the program starts running until the end of when you get the results out, that is the wall time. The other important sort of aspect to this is random access memory, or just memory. It's basically a type of memory that temporarily stores your data so close to the compute that it can almost instantly access it. So once you start running your computer program, there will be memory attached, very close to the CPUs, where the CPUs can go into the data, work on it, and give you outputs. So knowing how much memory your compute job would require would actually be quite a valuable exercise. But if you don't know, and if you're new to this, that's absolutely fine. I mean, as you run compute jobs, you will sort of learn more about how much resource you actually need. So that's not a problem, and our support team is really happy to help determine any of these if you don't already know. So moving our keywords into files and directories. Some of you may have already sort of seen this or already played around in your terminal or command line windows to navigate your file system. So when we actually look at our computer's file system, we can just go into folders like desktop or downloads, etc. So it is kind of like that. We're just moving into our different files and folders through the command line window. And so the very first directory that contains all your directories is actually the root directory. And so that is where you start connecting into all your different files and folders that are within it. So for example, if in this particular image, if I want to navigate to this folder called lib, I would, in my command line, I would type the command cd, which stands for change directory, and I would change my directory to /, which is where you start with the root, and then you move into user because that is now connected to user, and user then connects into the folder that we're interested in navigating to. And so this is just a very simple example of how you could quite easily connect into the different files and folders on your machine. This link here is a really useful one. It basically contains all the cheat sheets that NeSI has prepared of commands like this, like change directory and listing your different files on your file system to help you sort of navigate the file system on your command line. So please feel free to go have a look and start navigating your file system. What does your file system actually look like on NeSI? So the three main file paths that will be quite important for you to remember once you get on to the NeSI computers is your home directory, which is basically the root, and then going into a directory called home, and then your particular user assigned to when you get an account. And a project directory is where you would store all your project data. So that directory path would be the same here. So it'll be NeSI project, and then your particular project will allocate you when you asked for a new project or allocation. And then there is a no backup directory, which is once again NeSI, no backup, and those folder names remain the same, whereas, and you would then point it to your particular project folder. I just want to point out that the data that sits in project directory is backed up, and it is if there's data that you want to keep after your project is completed, we recommend that sits in your project directory. Whereas if there is data that is intermediary files that you would probably want to delete once your computer program stops running, then you would put it in something like the no backup directory, where there's no backup and this is data that can be disposed of. All right. And so now that we know how to maneuver the file system, how do we actually take data that's sitting in our local computers or laptops and push that onto the NeSI system. There are two ways to do this. The first is secure copy, and the second is Globus. Secure copy requires no prerequisite or no initial setup. You just basically type SCP, which is the command, onto your command line, and you would basically give it the directory that you want to transfer from and the directory that you want to transfer to. And so just to give you a quick, I'm not daring to do a demo here, but our support page that is linked here actually shows you quite clearly how you would use something like SCP to transfer files from your computer onto our computer, which is in this case the Mahuika system. And moving files from Mahuika to your local machine is also relatively straightforward using this SCP command, which stands for secure copy. All right. And talking briefly about Globus. Globus is actually a data transfer system that can be used as a graphical user interface, but also, but it does require some setup before you can actually start using it. So you could, if your institution already has Globus set up as an endpoint, you could transfer data from your institution's cluster onto NeSI, or alternatively, you could set up something called an endpoint on your laptop and transfer data from your laptop onto NeSI using your local endpoint. There is some documentation here on the link provided on the slide for you to have a little read. But if you're starting out and if you prefer, I recommend you start using secure copy, and as your data transfer requirements increase, you can always look into options like Globus. Also, one thing to note with Globus is it's easier to share data with collaborators, especially if they are not on the NeSI system or don't have access to your local machine. It actually makes it much easier to share data with collaborators. Some things to note when you're using the secure copy command is when you're sort of do not close the window or the terminal window as your data is being transferred unless you see the progress bar showing you that 100% of your data has been, because I have done that before. I have closed the terminal window too early, and a day later found out that just half my files were transferred. Just giving you a pointer, don't do that. And also to evaluate a successful data transfer, of course, compare the size of your files from wherever the source that you transferred it from and the destination that you transferred it to. Always compare the two file sizes are exactly the same. All right, and just moving swiftly on to some things to think about when you're starting off with a new project on NeSI. So when you start thinking about using an HPC system, some that are useful to know are sort of things like how much permanent or temporary disk space would you need? So earlier in the slides, I mentioned the project directory and the no backup directory. The project directory is basically your permanent disk space, so your data stays there untouched. And the no backup directory has an automatic deletion process, and it is not backed up, so it's not safe to put valuable data in there. So how much of that space do you actually need? It'll be really useful for you to know before you get started. Although, let me say, these are optional, and we will help you figure these out, or alternatively, you will be assigned a default sort of storage space to start off with, and you can always request So these are just pointers to tell you of things that you should be thinking about, but they're not absolutely necessary for you to start using a system like NeSI. The other thing that's really important to sort of know or learn over time as you run more jobs is the maximum amount of memory that you'll need to run a job. So I mentioned earlier in the jargon, I don't know if you remember, but there is a RAM or memory requirement that every job has. How much data will it instantaneously need to access to run your computer job successfully? It'll be really useful for you to know that. And some other things are how many CPUs will your job need? Or how long will your longest job be? And a lot of these questions you may not know from the outset, and you will get to know as you test run your computer programs or as you know more and more jobs over time. And a couple of things that is actually really important for us to know, just so that it helps us make the process much smoother for you, is what kind of software you'll be required to install on our systems, especially if they're not already installed on the NeSI system. And also, if the software requires any particular licensing, that is really important for us to know, because we want to be able to meet those licensing requirements before we make that software available on our system to you. Cool. And so this was my little tips to get started, and some things that I wish I had known when I started using NeSI. And so some ways to get in touch with us and keep connected. Our support team is extremely responsive, and they will answer your queries in a very at a very quick turnover rate. So please feel free to email them with any queries that you might have. That's the best place to go with any questions. And if you're ready to get started on NeSI, you can apply for access here. Follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn if you're interested to know the kinds of training activities we're running or conferences and workshops we're doing around New Zealand. And also our webinar recordings are available for you on our YouTube channel. And good luck with your projects. I'm really happy to answer any questions if you have any. And also, once again, our support team is really awesome. And so do email them and ask your questions. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nooriyah. That was very helpful. I will get you all to think about what your questions are. You can, of course, still pop them in the shared document. There is one in there at the moment. I'm wondering, and our helpers on the call have been busy answering that question. Would it be worth going through the answer to that in case it is something that is helpful for other people to learn from?
I guess it might be worth just noting that with the using SCP with those alias shortcuts like SCP Mahawika or Maui, I suppose, if you have a Maui allocation, you will have to have set up the terminal configuration for that shortcut to work, which I've linked on that support page, but it's also linked earlier in the talk somewhere. I can't remember which slide specifically. The one where you were setting up the, yes, this one, set up terminal. So you have to have your terminal set up for the SCP command to have, to work using that alias, which is we advise setting up because it's a very convoluted to SCP without that terminal set up. So we do suggest that if you are using a Mac or Linux or Windows with the Ubuntu subsystem or something.
Awesome. Are there any other questions? Would someone like to mute themselves and ask something to Nooriyah or to the app support guys on the call? Very happy to take any questions. And as Nooriyah already said, our app support is very awesome. So awesome that I think there were 3 people answering the question in the shared doc at once. They just couldn't resist. We love questions, so keep them coming, even if they pop up after the webinar is over. Emailing support@nesi.org.nz anytime with a question. We're very happy to help. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions coming up at the moment. I'll give you guys a last few minutes to think while I do a little bit of a wrap up. And if there aren't any questions, then we can just go ahead and end a bit earlier than we expected. So let me share my screen once again. Okie doke. So that's it for our webinar. Thank you so much, Nooriyah, for giving us the quick tips for getting started on NeSI. I do want to point you guys to that shared document once more in case you haven't had a look. At the top, there are a bunch of links, many of which Nooriyah pointed out in her slides. So if you do want to just go flick through those and have a little explore, please do. I would strongly recommend it. Emailing support@nesi.org.nz is the best way to get answers to your questions quickly. And then do check the NeSI website for the webinar recordings and slides. They'll be updated in the next few days. As I said, there are going to be 2 more NeSI know-how webinars as part of a little mini series. So if you are keen to know more about Jupyter on NeSI or GPUs, have a look at our website and sign up to one of those webinars as well. Guys, thank you so much for coming today. That's the end of our webinar. Thank you again, Nooriyah.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.